So we've had a pretty mild winter. It's March 21st today, and we did get a little storm with about 8 inches of snow. And typically what I do at least once a year is I have to shovel the snow out of my pumpkin patch. Just having the dark colored soil helps heat it up in the sun, and it allows me to set up my greenhouses. And I do have soil heating cables already in the ground, so all I have to do is plug them in, and that'll start heating up the soil as well. I have a little marker here where my soil heating cable is. So I will be plugging these in a few weeks, and I'll be getting my greenhouses set up because the fun's gonna start soon.
All the snow has finally melted in the pumpkin patch, so I got my greenhouses set up. These are both 10 feet by 20 feet, and they're made by Quick Tent. It's a fairly affordable option for a fairly big-sized greenhouse. You do get what you pay for. This one is brand new as of this year. It is supposed to be more sturdy compared to other years. This one is a combination of the same exact greenhouse, one of which is 4 years old and one of which is 3 years old. I've had so many parts break on both of them that I kind of just kept the good parts and made this. I do have some things I need to fix. There are many rips in the greenhouse, and you can see one here, there, and there's a big one over here that I gotta fix. And basically what's causing these rips is these little things here. And last year I would secure these onto the poles, and then it would get really windy, and these were nice and stable, but the seam would rip from the wind. So that would cause the rips. To solve that problem, I have these little clips from Home Depot. They're like $1 each, and I have them all over, just holding the tarp part of the greenhouse on. And that system works pretty well in terms of keeping the greenhouse tarp on. Now the other issue I have is when it's really windy out, the actual frame will lift up and blow away. So to fix that problem, I have rebar holding the frame down. I have it in 6 spots. I have it in each corner as well as in the middle, holding it tight. So that system works really well. So I just gotta kind of put some pieces back together on this one. The other thing I have going on is I have soil heating cables in the ground. I actually installed these soil heating cables last year. I basically dug a foot down, and I dug 4 feet by 4 feet, and I kind of squiggled the soil heating cables all throughout. And I didn't even take them out because I'm planting in the same exact spot this year because my patch is so small, I don't have any other choice. So I have those soil heating cables plugged in. I'm hoping they still work. And between that and the greenhouses, things are gonna warm up pretty quickly. One thing I wanted to point out when picking out where you're gonna plant your seedlings and where to set up your greenhouses, I look at my patch all year when the sun is very low in the winter, in the summer, and I like to see where the first sun hits the patch. And in my case, it's right there and right there. So those are the 2 spots where I set up my greenhouses because I want the seedlings to have the warmest start possible, and they want sun. So that's where they're gonna get the best sun. I have a lot of shadows from buildings, so we don't want to plant there or there. So we want lots of sun.
As soon as you can, you want to get a soil sample of your patch. You can see here how I do it, but I do explain it in more detail in a separate video. And you have to wait until your soil dries out because you don't want to be tromping around a muddy patch. And you also have to wait for the soil to thaw out. In March, it's still frozen. So for me, I was able to get this done on April 3rd. I usually start my seeds around April 10th. So by the time I get my soil test back, which last year it was April 16th, I don't have much time to figure out what amendments I need and get them spread out before I plant my seedling. So try to do it as soon as you can, but again, don't go running around your muddy pumpkin patch until things dry out a little bit. Once you get your soil test back, you want to figure out what you need to add for amendments to your pumpkin patch. So the soil test is going to come back with pH, percent organic matter, all the different types of nutrients. Nitrogen, don't quite worry about. Nitrogen's always going to be low in the beginning of the season. It leaches out of the soil real quick, and really the only way to get nitrates or ammonium, which is the actual nitrogen that can be used by the plant, is you need soil biology to convert atmospheric nitrogen to a form that's usable for a plant. Other than that, you need to add something like calcium nitrate or urea to get that available nitrogen for the plant. So that's a totally different discussion. So forget about nitrogen for now, but everything else you want to figure out what you need to add, if anything at all. The lab itself will give you recommendations, and Western Laboratories recommends it in pounds per 1,000 square feet for the macronutrients and ounces per 1,000 square feet for the micronutrients. If you want to take your growing to the next level, I would not go by the recommendations of the lab. I do not feel that they give high enough recommendations, and I'll explain that in a minute. This tool here is an extremely powerful tool called the Langley Soil Calculator. It's a huge Excel spreadsheet, and when you first look at it, you're going to be totally overwhelmed by it. I'll give you the gist of what it does, but there's actually a guy named Cecil Weston who has an amazing YouTube video, and he walks you right through it. And every single year I put his video on and I go through it with him every single year. In general, up here you have your patch size in square feet. So I have 2 plants in 1,870 square feet. Here in this section is where you put your soil test results. So whatever the soil test says for phosphorus, potassium, calcium, all that. Be careful. With the University of Maine, they actually do it in pounds per acre instead of parts per million. The Western Laboratories does it in parts per million. So make sure you're putting it in parts per million. So you enter all of those here. You put your pH here. And then what you can do from there is you choose amendments that you're going to add. So for example, my potassium was 163 and I wanted to be a lot higher than that. So I picked whatever potassium product I like. For me, it's 0050, which is sulfate of potash. So what you do is you come down here, you pick from the drop down, you pick whatever amendment you're going to add, you put it here, and then it's just a guessing game. You just enter a random number. So for me, it ended up being 53 pounds. And when you play the guessing game, what happens is anytime you enter a number, it'll go from your original value, it'll tell you how many parts per million you gained in this column, and then it'll give you your end parts per million. So watch here when I change the number down here. So I'm going to change it to 25. Hit enter. And then you can see that changes. The other thing you'll see change is the base saturation as well as these nutrient ratios. So what you're going to do is you're going to go through your whole soil test. And again, I recommend watching Cecil Weston's video because he recommends desirable amounts for all of these nutrients. And you're just going to go down, pick all your nutrients that you're going to use, play around with the numbers. And you want to find a balance between a good amount ppm wise, but you also want these base saturations to be within the range. So this column here tells you what your base saturation is. This tells you what the desired range is. So here it's 7.3% for potassium. It's within that range of 5 to 9. Calcium, 75%. It's within that 65 to 80%, and then kind of go down. Over here is the ratio of nutrients. The reason that's important is because certain nutrients affect the uptake of other nutrients in either a positive or a negative manner. So these are never going to be perfect, but you want to do your best. And Cecil will discuss which ones are the more important ratios to get right. One thing I want to mention is boron here. Boron is a scary micronutrient for a lot of gardeners because you can go from a deficiency to a toxicity really, really quick. The thing with giant pumpkins, though, is that it's hard to get toxic with boron. For example, the lab usually recommends 1 part per million max for gardens, and Ian Payton, who's probably the best grower in the world, says, no, it's really got to be more between 4 to 6 ppm. The reason being is you need that boron to bring the calcium into the plants. And if you think about it, the plant is taking in 50 plus pounds of water every single day. It's going to suck up a ton of boron and calcium. You need it that high to make all this stuff work. So this is why you don't always want to follow the lab's recommendations. So looking back here at my soil test, you'll see up here my boron level in the soil test was 0.5 parts per million, and Western Laboratories recommends 0.8 to 1.2 as a final level. I don't agree with that, so that's why I don't like following their recommendation. And if you look, they only recommend 0.3 ounces per 1,000 square feet, whereas in my Langley calculator, I'm adding 1.5 pounds to get it up to 4 parts per million. Now you'll also see that they also don't really recommend a ton of other stuff either. So for example, potassium, they recommend 6.6 pounds of potassium. Let's keep it 6 to make it simple. So I'm using 0050, which means the product has 50% potassium. So to get 6 pounds of potassium in my patch, I'd have to add 12 pounds of 0050. If you look here on my Langley calculator, I'm adding 53 pounds of 0050, which is way different than the 12 pounds that the lab recommends. These pumpkins are heavy feeders, and it is so important to get your soil dialed in at the beginning of the season. Ian Payton barely feeds his plants at all during the season because he gets the soil dialed in the very beginning. So don't be afraid to be a bit aggressive with your nutrients. You don't want to add them willy-nilly. You want to calculate it so that it's proper ratios and not too much because it can bind up another nutrient. But I highly recommend learning how to use the Langley calculator. Again, it can be very overwhelming at first, but if you follow along with Cecil Weston, you can do it.
I picked up most of my amendments yesterday, as well as a bigger fertilizer spreader. It's about 500 pounds worth of fertilizer. It's 400 pounds of gypsum to help increase the calcium level, as well as 100 pounds of Epsom salts to help increase magnesium. So we'll get this going and go from there.
Once you figure out how much of each nutrient you need to add, I use a fertilizer spreader to spread it all around the patch. Now this is just for the macronutrients, so potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, all the stuff that's big amounts, like 50-pound type deal. Some people say you can mix your micronutrients with your big amounts, but the smaller particles can settle down when you spread them, and what can happen is you can end up spreading a ton in one area of the patch, and then there's none left for the second half, and then you end up having a deficiency in one area and toxicity in the other. Check out my separate YouTube video on how I apply micronutrients to a large area. In my opinion, this is the best way to apply micronutrients evenly across a large area without having it concentrate in one area versus another. And it's best done before you plant your plants, because it's going to be a concentrated amount that you don't want to touch the foliage of your plant.